So namaste, welcome Aseem ji, Raghava, to this conversation we're going to have with the author of Grammar of Greed, a book that I've read and reviewed recently. And we're so delighted to have the author here to discuss his brilliant book. So Aseem ji is a writer, a professor, and an ecological thinker, speaker, etc. on economics. And his work revolves around the ecological crisis of the 21st century. And so he also has an upcoming book called The Alphabet of Ecosophy, and ecosophy being the field at the intersection of ecology and philosophy. He often combines the philosophy of Indian thinkers such as Tagore into kind of modern economics and ecological thinking. And I think it's kind of a revolutionary sort of line of thought, in the sense that, yes, we have critique of modernity, but it's often not intertwined with, practical solutions and kind of thinking about how policy can change and how frameworks can change systemically. So, so lovely to have you. I have a bunch of questions prepared, but they are broad, and please feel free to speak about whatever you're passionate about. And I'm just going to kind of touch on my my kind of experience with your book, and we go from there. So yes, first things first. So I read Grammar of Greed and reviewed it for our site. Thank you so much for sending it to us and sharing it with us. Kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about was how Grammar of Greed came to be, especially since you mentioned in the beginning of the book that it came together after years of sort of sitting, thinking, reflecting on today's ecological crisis, on modernity, on different aspects of just life today, such as technology and how it's affecting people, how it's affecting children, how it's affecting our experiences, how smartphones affect us, how we are affected by so many different consumerism and all of these modern kind of big paradigms and issues. So talk. I really want to know what your journey was like, how it came together, especially given the structure of the book, because this book is very interestingly structured in kind of a. And you mentioned this in the preface or forward. I'm not sure that you really want the reader to stop, pause, and reflect on each thing. And there's gaps, and there's a lot of space and a lot of time kind of given to the reader to reflect. So I want to know about your kind of thought behind this.
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to um, expound upon my ideas, which are not new at all. I think most people my age would be familiar with things that I've written about. Um, you asked about my journey towards this book or through this book, and I'll speak about that by telling you a story from 1987. And I have to go as far back as that because I had arrived in America to do my doctoral studies. And I was driving with a friend on New Jersey Turnpike from New York to Princeton, where we were visiting another friend. And it was, as you know, this 12-lane expressway coming out of New York City through Holland Tunnel and all that. And then you get on this 12-lane expressway. This was within the first few months of my being in America. And my friend, who had been in the US for some time, he was from this part of the world as well, he asked me, Aseem, do you think this is going to last? And we are both looking at the same scenery, the expressway, if you want to call that a scenery. And it's, of course, very imposing when you're on it, not that imposing when there's a cyclone or an earthquake. So he asked me, do you think this is going to last? And without thinking, instinctively, I responded, I just shook my head. And he smiled. And that was that conversation back in 1987. I have not changed my views in the slightest on this fundamental matter of whether a 12-lane expressway is going to survive. I always say, this is an aside, I always say that the most influential person of the 20th century by a long mile was Adolf Hitler, but not just for the reasons that the world thinks of, which is to say the Second World War and all the consequences in terms of shaping the world order that came after that, that Hitler precipitated. I think of Hitler as much as the author of the Autobahn and the Volkswagen, right? The people's car and the people's highway, so to speak. The Autobahn is, the biggest investment in the Third Reich period in the 1930s, and it was the first major international national roadway system connecting German cities to industrialize faster and to militarize faster. And then Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he was president in the early 50s, pushed through something called the Defense Highway Act, which you can look up, and which basically argued that the United States needs to have an interstate system, much like, that was not mentioned, of course, much like Germans. And that's how the interstate system came into being, with those green signs which are all over our expressways now in India and China and the world over. But the prototype is set in Germany in the 1930s, not to be forgotten. Now, how did I come to write this book? This was not intended at all. What I do is do some writing, and it's always in pencil and it's always in notebooks which are scattered all over my home. And this habit goes back about 40 years. And over the years, there's a lot of scribbles here and there. And occasionally, I do look up what I've written 20 years ago, just to remember how I felt on a certain occasion or what the experience meant and so on. And these days, when memory is fading for more reasons than just aging, it's good to go back to the handwritten page from 20 or 30 years ago to see whether what you were thinking at that time made sense then and what sense it makes now, and that sort of thinking. While doing this about a decade ago, a friend said, why don't you pull out some of the ones which you think would be relevant today and put it together in some form? And that's how, I put together a notebook which was drawn from the notebooks and everything written in hand. And then I sort of started typing it. And before I knew it, I had something off book length. And then while I was typing it, a lot of new thoughts came, which are also now part of this book. So that's been the journey. And the reason I say there should be pauses between the different entries in the book is because sometimes the gaps between two successive entries are 5 years or 10 or more. The time I've written one line and the time I've written the next line are 10, 20 years apart. So it's been that sort of thing, unintended, and hopefully of some relevance and use to others. Uh, Greed, as I say in the beginning itself, is an ancient theme, and everybody seems to think we understand greed. I'm not sure anymore if I understand greed myself.
Yeah, I agree. Reminds me of what was that book, Fahrenheit something, where
Fahrenheit
there's the
4,
dystopian world. Yeah, yeah. So there's
Ray
a
Bradbury.
dystopian world where books don't exist, they're banned and so on. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I do relate to your even though I feel like we're generations apart. I feel like there's uh, a lot of truth to this, and I feel like just a little bit of reflection leads us to what you've said. Some of your reflections are very cleverly phrased and just punchy. So I enjoyed it. So yeah, then next coming to um, what do you think like the grammar of greed is, and how kind of it's how greed as like a not just a vice but it's embedded into all the systems. Um, it's part of growth itself and ideas like development, which are all tied back to, like you mentioned, in your upcoming chapter also, the scientific revolution, and how that has contributed to the entire ecological crisis that we see today. So, how do you think it's encoded, and what do you think about it? What is the core of this?
Can I use some Hindi, or is Hindi going to be difficult for people to follow? Uh,
Go
uh,
ahead, please.
so I was raised in North India. My mother is from UP and Bihar, and my father is from Madhya Pradesh. So I'm very much from the Bimaru states of India. And one of the things that our grandmothers would raise us on, and not just our grandmothers, but pretty much everybody, lalach buri bala hai. Greed is a bad habit, right? That's very deep inside every Indian, I think. And that's partly what it means to be from this part of the world. Now I go to America, 1987, and in 1990 I watch Michael Douglas in Wall Street, and he says greed is good. The gecko creed. Gordon Gecko is, who he plays in the film, and the gecko creed is greed is good. And that film, I thought it was farcical. I mean, it's not a film. I don't know what it is, but I had utter contempt for that movie. And little did I realize that I was the one who was actually, you know, the butt of the joke, because everybody else seemed to take that seriously, and that became pretty much the mantra of the world after the end of the Cold War. Greed became official, so to speak. It got officialized and systematized in a way in which uh, it had always been systematic for most of modern history. And capitalism, as we know, functions on the basis of organized greed. But what happened in the 90s was no alternative to greed could be imagined, which is to say, it became the operative default in the global era. And I come from economics. I was trained in economics as an undergraduate, and I did my doctorate in economics. And in economics, we use euphemisms because no economist dare call something by its proper name. If you do that, you won't get tenure, you lose your job, you won't get conference invitations, and no prime minister wants to make you his advisor. So you've got to hide behind euphemisms, you've got to hide behind hyperboles. When you're exaggerating the faults of your rivals and your enemies and other ideologies, you want to exaggerate. When you want to talk about your own problems, you underplay. And this is standard practice now everywhere, not only in governments and institutions, but also in academia, media, everywhere. This is not doublespeak, this is multi-speak. And depending on who we are speaking to, we speak this or that language. So I found that they were using the Americans, and the Americans are the ones who set the norms for not just economics now. They use the word incentivization, right? So when you incentivize something, what are you doing? And I understood this immediately in my undergraduate days here in Hindu College itself. I understood this as bribing. ये तो घूस दे रहा है, you know. I'm an Indian, I'm a desi. यहाँ पे तो आप कोई धंधा नहीं कर सकते हैं घूस दिए बगैर. So corruption is the oil of the economy. The only thing the white man has done is that he has made laws to defend that corruption and hide it behind noble names and institutions. But what is operating behind the scenes, what the lobbyists are doing in Washington, is basically, you know,
The
systematization,
same thing.
bribing. You know,
Yeah.
basically bribes. It's just that the public doesn't, mind it because it's in the law, as the Americans say. It's the law. So when something is the law, you follow. That's why I put this line in the book: consume. It's the law, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
President Bush's solution to depression, economic depression, was go and shop.
To
Did you
consume.
shop?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so on. So shopping, retail therapy, I mean, you know this better than me. This is pretty much given as the mantra of the times. You are what you wear, you are what you eat, you are where you live, you are what your car is, etc. You are identified by the scale and quality of your consumption, uh, and that's about it. What's inside you, your thinking, your feelings, your mind, let alone your heart and soul. Soul doesn't exist. Mind and heart, that none of that matters nearly as much as the appearance of who your persona is. So our personas are living our lives, they're living at our expense, but we don't mind because others think the world of us, and that's what matters. What we really think of ourselves in the privacy of our intimate moments, quite irrelevant, you know.
Right.
So that's the way the self has been pushed out in the age of the so called individual. And like I say in the book at more than one place, it's the mendacity of modern man to believe that this is a world that is giving you individual freedom. Because what modernity has done, it has sliced the individual into two parts, handed over the public life of the individual as a citizen to the state, which surveils everything there. So the life as a citizen is in the hands of the state. Private life, the other part, is auctioned off to digital corporations, and the individual is nowhere in sight, is in fragments everywhere. So this is what I call digitized systemism now. We live in a manipulated universe. We live in a universe in which uh, people have reached the point where not only do they not trust others, they don't trust themselves. Actually, not trusting others begins with self distrust, and it comes with conquest. When you go and do something nasty and nobody notices it, you forget that you have noticed it.
Yeah.
And that is going to haunt you and catch you sooner or later. And very soon, in order to live after that, you're going to project it onto others. It's like what Mr. Putin told Mr. Trump some years back: you see the splint in my eye, you don't see the log in your own. I suppose Trump could say the same to Putin, and so on and on and on. So, this is the way not only politics functions now, this is the way I would argue all ideologies function, all academia functions. Uh, and you create in the process a society of endless distrust, where peace is a mere word, where freedom is an illusion, and everything is pretty much orchestrated by the global market. So, this orchestration is very much at the heart of what I think of as the grammar of greed. Until you get some sense of the overall perspective, the overall framework, which is generating, producing, and reproducing greed in people and legitimizing it under fancy names like incentivization, growth, development, progress, blah, blah, blah. Unless we get to the bottom of this heap, we'll be permanently confused. And the only way to get to the bottom of the heap, I argue, is to go back to grandmother's values. They're very simple, they're elementary for anybody who's grown up in this country. And it doesn't even have to be said. I mean, a simple thing, a simple example. When we were kids, not when you were kids, when we were kids, uh, sweets in the house, mithai. How often would we have them? Maybe once a month, not more than twice a month, usually at a festival, and always with a group of people, never alone. You'd not smuggle yourself into the kitchen at night, open the fridge, and see if there are rasgullas there and have a couple for yourself. That's not the way we used to eat as children. Birthdays were typically not even celebrated. I mean, I remember my 10th birthday was celebrated, and that's about it. I'm told by my mother my first birthday was celebrated, but I have no memory of it. And I don't remember a single birthday in childhood. I remember after going to America, age 25, every single year, the birthday is celebrated. What is going on? What is going on is that Aseem Shrivastava is getting infantilized by the society around him, right? And now you have 70-year-old men in shorts enjoying their softy ice cream cones, And nothing's wrong with it except that your sugar and your blood pressure and your da 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 da. But there's no we've lost all sense of what maturity means. We've lost our sense of emotional and spiritual balance. Um, so all this I've tried to understand throughout my years and tried to see what is the order in the chaos, what is the method in the madness. Is there a red thread at the bottom of this haystack, or are we condemned to just lose ourselves in the hay and get burnt when the sun gets really hot on us? So this has basically been my project for many years. And I realized, and thankfully I was trained in the sinful science of the day, the dismal science of economics. So I know enough economics to not be fooled by any economists, but not more than that. I don't need to know more than that. So economics is the theology of our day. I mean, today's mullahs are sitting in Harvard and Stanford and Oxford and Ashoka, where I've also taught. And I used to say this in Ashoka when I was teaching there as well, that this is where you will find today's mullahs and so on. And by this, I don't mean to say anything negative about Muslims. I will say the same thing about bigoted pundits or bigoted, bishops or who have you. So what we call in Hindi bal ki khal nikalna, splitting hairs, is what goes on in today's academia in the name of rigor. That's what we call rigor. You lose the forest for the trees. You get so deep inside the tree, you forget it's a tree. You give it scientific names. You live in a world of permanent abstractions, and you say, this is science, and this is the only form of knowledge which will exist, and we've got to respect this and make sure everybody is scientific when they open their mouth in public. So this is the technocracy of the times, and it's masking all the greed that is lying at the bottom of the haystack, which is being orchestrated by the global market, where there are a handful of players, what I call the cloud elites. The term is from my friend Sandeep Narang, who might be listening in, and he uses the term cloud elites to describe what happens in the clouds today when you're saving a file, or I mean, you have to refer to the cloud at every second moment of your life now. So there's a lot of greed in the clouds, and it's raining on us, and we are getting wet, but we're not allowed to use any umbrella except the one they sell us.
Absolutely. So I think you touched on a lot of the crises that modernity has induced, whether it's um, the facade of freedom, individual freedom, um, or whether it's overconsumption and depersonalization uh, and nucleation of families, etc. Um, so, how do you think that ecosophy comes in here? How do you think kind of in is individual sort of transformation the only way forward, or is it a cultural movement, or what do you think the kind of antidote is to this sort of kind of systemic greed that the modern empires have built, the Western
Right.
imperialist models? Yeah,
See, the thing with systemically originating problems is that they do not have individual answers, or shall I say, exclusively individual answers. They will have to have systemic answers. Now, what the modern West has unleashed over the last 5 centuries since Columbus, one has to go as far back as that. What the modern West has unleashed upon the world is a cyclone, is an earthquake, and not one, but a cascade of catastrophes. The genocide of the Native Americans in the US, the enslavement of Black Africans, taking them to the US, all this lies at the very foundation of modern American civilization. This is why I refer to the stories about Native Americans in my book. There's a couple of places where I've referred to that. And the reason is because now, if I was to put the point very bluntly, we don't need so many countries in the world. We don't need 200 or 220 countries because there is only one, and you know the name. So America is not a country anymore. It's a state of mind. It's a way of being. It's a whole selfistan universe which everybody has now been sent to, or consigned to, or confined to. We use the word the bubble, yeah,
Hmm.
and we know what happens to bubbles. They don't last forever. Yeah, they burst sometime, and not just because somebody from outside pricks them, but because the internal pressure makes them implode. That's the model of humanity that American globalization has brought about. This cannot go on. As they say, what can't go on forever will not go on forever. So the downfall of America as we know it is inevitable, just like the downfall of Europe was inevitable. Just like, you don't go around marauding cultures and ecologies for 3 4 centuries and expect that that violence is not going to come back to haunt you. And so the First World War, which used to be called the Great War, I think of it as the first modern war of European ambition, and the second one was the Second War of European ambition with a Japanese footnote or a Japanese appendix. And that's all that it, it really means. So the US is in that place where, with 400 million guns in private hands in the country, those guns are, not just going to line the cupboards. So it's not something which, one can avoid. One should speak about it with some humility because these are very real prospects for the future. And the way modernity has proceeded on its conquests across the centuries and the continents, the blowback is coming now not just from other cultures and conquered cultures, but also from conquered ecologies. One of my favorite American writers is Wendell Berry. And Wendell Berry, who's a farmer and a writer, he would always say he's a farmer first and a writer second, but he's as great a writer as he is a farmer. And in my view, one of the greatest American writers of the last 100 years, if not, right up there. And he says our places are asking us questions to which we do not have answers. Our places are asking us questions to which we do not have answers. So that's the problem posed from the ecological side. From the cultural side, one of my teachers, who I wish I had met, I've never met him, he's now passed on. His name is Raimundo Panikkar, who's an Indo-Spanish, philosopher theologian. Father was from Malabar in Kerala, mother from Catalonia in Spain, and one of the great philosophers of religion in the last century. He worked in about 4 or 5 languages, knew Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and so on. So he says in one of his books that how do we know we are in a crisis of culture? We know we are in a crisis of culture because we do not have answers to the questions our children are asking. So that's the cultural analog to what Wendell Berry is saying, right?
Yes.
Now, there's a third thing. There's a third thing. And just this evening, when a student was visiting, he was telling me about some friend of his who's seeing a therapist. And I was smiling, and he said, "Why are you smiling? It's a serious thing." So I said, "Well, therapy is serious for some, and it's a joke for others, and sometimes it's both those things together. But in our time, uh, this pandemic had not been unleashed, where everybody was seeing their therapist. The joke used to be that Woody Allen's film Annie Hall, he's saying to Annie Hall, look, you have a problem with me, you get your therapist to speak to my therapist. So so the climate has changed when it comes to mental health, psychic well-being. The wellness industries, what are they going to do if people actually become well? I mean, for God's sake, why would you go to Jindal in Bangalore, or why would you go to some other therapy place? Even some of the Ayurveda places would not be necessary if we were actually living healthy lives. So the way now that the whole market has been set up is that there's
It
oftentimes
perpetuates problems.
solutions looking for problems. Okay.
Right.
See, I've got this profiteering industry in making hammers. There better be nails to drive into walls, otherwise I'm going to be out of work. What am I going to do with my employees? They'll be unemployed. So you've created this vast perverse economy where you have a set of industries, battery of industries generating problems, and another battery of industries competing to find solutions to those problems. And when both of them grow, we say economic growth is happening, and gross domestic product, which is truly gross, is going on. This is what we call development. This is so these metrics are themselves perverse. And having spent a lifetime or wasted a lifetime, whichever way you want to describe it, in economics, nobody's going to convince me out of this opinion that economics is an intellectual disease masquerading as the discipline of science that it pretends to be. There's nothing scientific about it, never was. It's always a certain modern theology necessary to keep modern societies duly confused and ignorant about the real nature of things. So uh, that's how I see this whole thing. Now, ecosophy. Now, Rabindranath, who you mentioned when you were talking about me earlier, Rabindranath's last testament is what is called Shobhita Shankot, which is Crisis in Civilization. That's a radio address which he records just a few weeks before his death in August 1941. Now, crisis in civilization is not just crisis in Indian civilization. Actually, he's not talking about crisis of Indian civilization at all. He's talking about the crisis of modern civilization. Just like Gandhi in Hind Swaraj is not talking about India alone. In fact, he says explicitly in Hind Swaraj, India is being ground down not under the heels of British rule so much as under the heels of modern civilization. Right? And both are at one on this. So, the crisis in civilization that Rabindranath has in mind has now reached a certain kind of, it's approaching a certain climax. And as I say in my book, it's approaching a certain toxic climax. In other words, an ecological climax. We are already in the middle of that phase of history when a 500-year-old massive structure is unraveling. And however, in Hindi we say mara hua hathi sawa lakh ka. Even a dead elephant is auctioned for $1,000,000. So you watch out. And the trapeze artists are in office. The barbarians are not at the gate, they're in the palace. And so when they fall, they will create a lot of ruckus. You better get away somewhere, otherwise you get hurt. So what Rabindranath meant by crisis in civilization, we can now understand much better, perhaps even much better than Rabindranath himself could have anticipated, although he anticipated a huge amount. He was prophetic in so many of his pronouncements. So the crisis exists at three levels of civilization. The relationship of human beings to each other, which is to say culture. The relationship of human beings to the natural world, the rest of nature. And thirdly, equally important, the relationship of human beings to themselves, right? The psychic level. So there's an ecological crisis, there's a cultural crisis, and there's a psychic crisis. And all three are going on simultaneously. They cannot and should not, in all integrity and humility, be disentangled. They can't be. So we are living in a time when the more problems there are, the more money there is to make. Capitalism loves crisis because with every crisis comes a panoply of solutions which are auctioned, and the market does well. You know, when George Bush Jr. went to Iraq in 2003, I'd written a piece which was called "The Iraq War is a Huge Success." And the reason for writing that piece in 2004 was because everybody then was arguing that the Iraq war is a huge failure because, look, we were told this lie about weapons of mass destruction. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And all that ammunition we blew up was in vain and it's wasted wealth. And besides, guess what? It killed people. Surprise. So I said, this was part of the agenda. This was part of the intention. Why? Because when you look at the stock values, the stock valuations of all those defense contractors who were supplying ammunition for bombing Iraq, they did extremely well. And if you look at
Yeah.
the stock values of the reconstruction companies, the water companies, the infrastructure firms, Dick Cheney's Halliburton, they were doing extraordinarily well as well. Their stocks were going through the sky. Then I looked up Vietnam War data and I found exactly the same thing. The Vietnam War was something the Americans lost, but the American economy did not lose. They
Gained
won,
from it, yes. Yes.
gained from it. So, in the same
Arguably,
way,
it's happening again currently.
argue, not arguably, I will convince
Well,
anyone me
obviously, yeah, yeah. Right.
this. So there is a business model behind
Yeah.
war, behind terrorism, the spread of weapons. There's a business model, and then the warehouses get thinned out. Then you need to call ceasefire. When the warehouses fill up, you say war. You know, there's no peace. There's war, ceasefire, war, ceasefire. That's how it goes. And ceasefire, we are happy to call peace. So, ecosophy, to complete my answer to your question, would look at all these things in an interrelated way and would look at the ecological crisis of the earth in conjunction with the cultural crisis of civilization, in conjunction with the psychic crisis that individuals are going through, and not try to artificially separate and disentangle these things. In short, Panikkar says ecosophy is the wisdom of the earth, and there's no way we can avoid the wisdom of Mother Earth if we are to live on Earth with some degree of peace and stability in the future.
Had a bit
Yes.
of a perspective that I wanted to share with Aseemji and get his opinion on. Uh, I think this framing of multi-crisis is actually one crisis that's manifesting in many. There are a lot of new thinkers from the West as well who are trying to frame it this way, and they do it very beautifully. One of the ways in which I have sort of understood this is, uh, firstly, the hijacking of desire. And Rene Girard talks about this. How is human desire formed? And desire, he says, is mimetic, in the sense that we learn our desire by watching something. Right? And this, if I observe it and if I look at how desires are formed, this has a kernel of truth, and there can be an exploration of that. But once that is there is also a dislocation of that with technology. When we were growing up, when you were growing up, and partly when I was growing up as well, because I consider myself to be the generation that sort of transitioned into the digital era, but we have some kind of connection still with the pre-digital era. Uh, our desires were mostly formed based on the cognitive and the tactile feedback loops that we had within a certain radius, right? 25, 30 kilometers, 50 kilometers, largely 100 kilometers at most, right? Because you used to look at things that your culture used to offer and you wanted to mimic that, and you formed your identity on the basis of that. Now, Balgangadharaji, S.N. Baluji, has a very seminal insight about globalization. And he says globalization is not just the export of labor and capital, it is the export of the methods of conflict. Our conflicts today are also not ours. That is because at the psychological level, the desire formation process, particularly with exponential technology, what happens to this process of mimesis is that I'm no longer in a cognitive relationship with the rest of the physical reality. That has been hijacked by the digital. And therefore, and this design is very insidious. And I've been in games, so we understand the power of the design and technology combined. The bottomless scroll is not an innocuous choice. It is something that was experimented. It was something that was backed by science in how to infuse dopamine. We are like the lab rats of Skinner. And therefore, this bottomless scroll is now relentlessly beaming desire for you to be mimicked. I understood this first time, Aseemji, when I think it's 2013 or 14, when I looked at a cultural trend of ice bucket challenge. Some bloke in Norway, I think, was icy cold, and he decided to put a bucket of water on himself. And three
Norway,
days
so
later, 3 days later, I saw my boss do it and post it on Facebook. Right now, of course, it was funny. It was cultural meme and all of that. But what it taught me is the rapid export of desire through technology, right? And this means that you are untethered. The cognitive and the material feedback loops that you had to contain your desire has now been unshackled. And through that process, there are two things that are happening. One, you're not connected to the life process at all as part of capitalism and market economy. Anyways, you look at the nicely presented, filtered image of milk. You don't see the dusty street in which the cow has to walk. Right, that cognitive link itself is broken. The second thing that is happening is your desired location itself has changed, and especially if you look at the form factor, because you talk about technology, the form factor of a mobile is something that allows you to go lean back and actually completely take away your peripheral vision, which means that there is no other cognitive or tactile feedback loop from the world of material, world of atoms, that is actually registering in your neural pathways. It is now entirely digital. And through this, it is, you said psychological, ecological, and cultural. It is also the neural level now. These are neural reflexes that have been developed. Of course, that has an impact on psychology. So that was one observation that I had, and I wanted to share that with you and get your perspective on locating this in the hijacking of desire using technology. That's one. And what is the process of that? The second is more economics, and there are thinkers who write about this. The reduction of all values into currency, and then the responsibility of being able to print currency. So I see three compounding factors that are actually leading to the moment of crisis. And I also wanted to present, or not present, but take your view on an alternate point of view as a mark of respect to people who are arguing against this. But firstly, the three factors: one, your desire production is hijacked. Two, you have the idea of free debt, right? Which is basically you can not only produce desire, but you can also think you are under the illusion that you can afford your desire right now and pay later. And then you have the exponential technology, which is not just giving you this desire, but culturally sanctioning you to actually put that on social media and say this is the cultural norm now, and if you get like, you're getting validated for this, so your identity is also hijacked. So this clash that you mentioned between a surveillance state and a sovereign individual, there is no balance. You have the American model or the Chinese model for say, but you don't have what we call from a Indian worldview dharmic model. So that's one. Secondly, I think what is also obstructing people from being able to see this is what Ralph Thurm calls very poetically. He calls this the phantom capacity. He says that the car is not just driving to the edge of the cliff; the car has left the cliff. We are just not able to see it because there is a phantom carrying capacity. So because somebody has said we will run out of materials in certain years, and there is argument that new technology will make it efficient, this idea of technological advancement, pushing energy limits, pushing new discoveries, and making sure that we will always have an abundance is what he alludes to as the phantom capacity. This illusion that we are in, that we will keep discovering new things and that will create new surplus, seems to be a cognitive block for us to register. So I wanted your thoughts on this. Firstly, from a desire perspective, and then this combination of these three things: exponential technology, debt, and the desire production, which is constant in a market sense, especially because digital economy, the transaction costs are nil as you scale, unlike the world of materials, unlike the world of atoms. And thirdly, what is stopping more people from being able to see this? Apart from the professional hazards of seeing it, cognitively, what is stopping?
The last question is easy to answer, so I'll answer it first. When you're inside this gigantic bleeding whale, or let's say a biotechnologically artificially reared octopus, because octopuses are small, I say in my book also. But imagine that biotechnology generates an artificial octopus like the blue whale, so something of that scale. And then it's bleeding. But when you're inside this octopus, how do you know it's even an aquatic animal? You have no clue. See, if you think about it another way, another metaphor, I always say, uh, before the Great War, before 1914, much of the train had not entered the tunnel. After the Great War, everyone born is born inside the tunnel. How do they know there is a blue sky outside? They don't. They only imagine it. They think it's fantasy. So I've said in my book at one point that to render goodness exotic or something like that is one of the great achievements, moral achievements of modernity. So in other words, evil is here to stay. Goodness, maybe, because evil is something you make money of. There's good bites in the media, and academia has more problems to tackle, and it's very, very fertile for the economy. Goodness is kind of boring. I mean, if everybody was Gandhiji, who's going to buy anything in the supermarkets? So a secure human being who's spiritually somewhat evolved is a dangerous consumer because he's not a consumer at all. So consumption requires individual and publicly acknowledged neurosis. This is necessary. That's why the entire world of advertising and messaging is so dense and deep now. I agree with the whole perspective which you presented. In fact, I'll refer to two aspects of my work which are still to be published. One is this ecosophy book which Priya mentioned, The Alphabet of Ecosophy, in which there is a chapter called Homo Abstractus, with a hyphen between abstract and us, right? Because we've now been rendered abstract by the technologies which prey upon us. We are carrion for the vulture of technology now. So in that chapter, I actually develop very, very similar ideas to what you say, and I weave them into, on the one hand, an ecological perspective, the other hand, a cultural and a psychic perspective, the breakdown of identities, the reason why there's a structural issue and everybody needs to see a therapist because nobody can trust their own friends anymore. Friends are no longer friends, but friends. Potential enemies or frenemies or whatever. I mean, words abound, but basically you get my point. So that's one place where I refer to it in my work. I mean, all of what you said is actually a different way to express what I've been saying. I desire, therefore I am. In the 21st century, Descartes would say that, And that's the basis of my Tagore book, where I use a word from Bangla which Tagore coined, and nobody could tell me the meaning of this word. And maybe I should speak about it for a minute because it might be of interest to you. So the Tagore book is called For Love of the Earth, Modernity, Ecosophy, Rabindranath Tagore. And the entire book takes as its point of departure a speech that Rabindranath makes, an Abhibhashan he gives in Sriniketan in 1938. And in that talk, he makes the following statement in Bangla. I'll translate it for you. Manush gridnu bhave prithvir danke grohan koreche. Meaning, it is with a certain restless greed that humanity approaches the bounty of nature. But this Gridnu Bhav, I looked up in every Bangla dictionary. I couldn't find the meaning. Bengali, English, no chance. Googled it, no chance. It's not there anywhere. And then I was reading the Ishavasya Upanishad in order to get deeper into Rabindranath because he's schooled in the Brahmo tradition. And one summer, about 8 years ago, my mother and I read 18 shlokas of the Ishavasya over 18 days in Ramgarh in Uttarakhand. And the penny dropped one day when I was taking a walk in the forest, and the first shlok of the Ishavasya, which talks about. Let me see if I can say it first, and then I'll translate it. Ishavasya midam sarvam yatakincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bhunjitha magruda
Kasya siddham. Yeah.
Kasya. So know that everything in the universe that you see is enveloped by God. Covet not anything, for nothing here is yours. Now, this business covet not is from that Sanskrit expression magruda. And Gruda in Sanskrit, as you know, means vulture, right? And which in Hindi becomes Gidd, and in Bangla becomes Giddu, right? So Gridnu Bhav is the bhav or the passion in the vulture when it's circling the carrion from the sky. The eagerness, the restlessness with which the vulture awaits his next meal is the way we look at nature, right? One shouldn't be unkind to vultures. I don't think vultures are capable of the kinds of greed that humanity is now manifesting. But as a metaphor, this works. So,
Such a beautiful metaphor, also.
yes. And so I took this as the basis of my book. And the entire book is about Gridnu Bhav because it goes a bit deeper than desire, actually. It talks about desire. I quote the Rig Veda at one point, where the Rig Veda says life begins with desire. The Rig Veda never says life should also end with desire, does it? So, from desire, you can go in two directions. You can go towards power or you can go towards love. Uh, Most of us go that way, not this way. And so the spiritual evolution of our culture for thousands of years, since ancient Sanatan times, has actually emphasized, because desire is not invented by modernity, desire is ancient, it's inborn. Like the Rig Veda says, without desire, there is no life. The question is, how disciplined or cultured or spiritualized is your desire? And today, it's not even a discussion, you know. So we need to tackle this from our very rooted Indian stance, or shall I say, uprooted for the time being Indian stance, wherein we must bring this into the discussion front and center. That look, just because we are born through desire does not mean that this is the be all and the end all, and the only way you can go from desire is towards power by exercising your will and take control of other people's resources and so on, cause wars. That's a very low way of living, you know. The real challenge spiritually and in human terms and in service of the greatest values, not only of this culture but many other cultures, is to go in the other direction. Okay, so every child is born, you can say, as much from love as from desire, right? If power plays a part, then that becomes a part of the child's karmic destiny. The only law which I take seriously in the universe is the karmic one. I don't think there is any easy exit, any exit from the karmic law. I deeply hold that here, not here. And the West, the modern West, has lost sight of its own mythologies, its own best, imaginative minds in the past. Goethe, Leonardo, there are many who have warned them not to go to the places where they are now taking the whole world. Okay, they used to say, "Fools go where angels fear to tread." In today's world, everybody's angels are on holiday, you know, and the devils are having a party, you know. So, what kind of culture is going to come out of it except one which ends and soon? So, Gridnu Bhav for me is very much the way modern man is living, you know, especially digitized humanity now. So you're not allowed to take a holiday from the internet. No, 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 no sabbatical from the internet. Not allowed. You know. So what is this if not consumer coercion? It's a severe form of thought control, feet control, heart control. It's tyranny. But of course, it's called democracy. You know. I'm not a Democrat, just so you know.
No, no,
No.
neither are we. We are, I think I agree with you, and thank you for that illuminating perspective. And I know I'm conscious of your time as well. Just one thing, your explanation reminded me of in Karnataka, near Bengaluru, there is a temple, Boganandiswara temple, which is basically the explanation of life. At the bottom of the hill is Boganandiswara. At the top of the hill is Yoganandiswara. And the whole metaphor is that what you just said, Indriya Sukha, which is where you begin, but you have to go towards the Atma Sukha, which is what Professor Mohan Raghavanji talks about in his book. and this has been culturalized. What the cognitive feedback loop has been so richly embedded in our culture that in every every part of India, you will see this returning to the base once again. That this is not it. You have to go towards the yoga. You have to go towards the union. So that just reminded us of our work, because at Brihat we are all about how do you talk about this meta unit of culture, and this is core to our ambition as well. Sai, over to you. Sorry, I know that we are.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I think we'll sort of wrap up. I'll just touch on a few more points, and maybe you can address some of it. I think it's a powerful way that you framed the technological sort of totalitarianism that pervades our, every day. And for this, I feel like just reflecting on this, and I know you've reflected deeply on it in your book. One thing I want to say before this is maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but in your reading of Tagore, has there been some sort of kind of conclusion that you've come to, in the sense that how do we what are some of the urgent interventions that we can make because of this? You've framed the crisis very well. The crisis exists at three different levels: the behavioral, the cultural, the psychic. But so do you think there are some sort of urgent interventions that we can make? And then coming back to the line of thought that I was going, I'm sorry, I tend to do this. Thinking about the entire technocratic regime that pervades, do you think that there is sort of an authentic ecological future for us, especially now, given that the entire discourse around sustainability has also been, like Raghava mentioned, also framed as if there is a technological solution to the ecological crisis? I feel like every company is looking towards, say, for instance, saying that electric cars are the future, when it requires mining of silicon and mining of inert materials that are far more damaging to the ecosystem than perhaps petrol mining for gases. So how do you think these sort of this sort of malady can be addressed?
Do I have about 5 or 10 minutes to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I'll answer the second question first, and then I'll come to the question of intervention and even the language of intervention. I'll object to that language, and I'll tell you why. In economics, we learned something useful also sometimes. One story which I learned a lot from was this. In the 1860s, in Britain, there was a major coal crisis, serious shortage of coal. So they were bright people, so they thought up more efficient boilers, furnaces, hydraulic presses, engines, whatever was using coal, wayfeeders. They started building more efficient systems. More efficient means what? Would give you more energy for the same amount of coal input, right? In purely physical, technical terms.
Yeah.
And there were technical breakthroughs of phenomenal kinds. Did that solve the coal crisis? Answer is coal prices went up after these innovations. Why would that happen? Think about it.
Jevons paradox.
Jevons. So what happened was explained by this economist called William Stanley Jevons. And he said that, look, in a competitive system, the goalposts will always shift if you, allow for greater technical efficiency. Suddenly, because you're constantly thinking what your competitor or your rival in the market is going to do. He's going to use more efficient machinery to produce even more. So you want to outdo him, right? And he will think the same about you. And so there's a ratchet effect, which leads to greater demand for coal. And no matter how much coal is supplied, there'll always be a potential shortage, right? So this is a Jevons paradox as it operates in production. But the Jevons paradox also explains what happens in consumption. So like in the 1960s, uh, towards the end of the 60s, they started building more fuel efficient engines because there was a rise in the price of oil and so on, early 70s especially. There was an oil crisis in 73 and another one then followed in 79. They started building more fuel efficient cars. And then what did people do? They started moving out of the cities into the suburbs and started driving 20, 30 miles to work. Or they started driving to the supermarket where earlier they would walk to the neighborhood store. Or they would start taking their children on longer driving holidays. But consumption just rose dramatically in response to fuel efficient cars. So, in other words, there is no supply based answer to the ecological crisis. This is a simple illustration of how no supply based answer will work. In Delhi, when I first came here in 1978 from Patna, people were complaining of bad traffic, really bad traffic. And there were only 4 flyovers in the city, and people said, we need to build more flyovers. Come and have a look now. There's about 400 flyovers, and traffic problems are infinitely worse than they were in 1978. So, in other words, there is no, this is a generalization I'm happy to make in front of any parliament or senate. There is no supply based answer to the ecological crisis. It'll have to be a demand based answer going to the roots of desire, like Raghava was mentioning. Okay, there's no escape from that spiritual imperative. I want to use that word very precisely. Nobody talks about the spiritual imperative. There is a spiritual imperative upon every living creature, not only a human, to wake up from this body and realize that you are not this body only. Unlike
It's
what the
beautifully
modern
put.
West, unlike what the modern West has taught the world. And now even the body doesn't exist, only your persona on the internet. In other words, some filaments of digital is what defines who Priya is and who Raghava is and who Aseem is and so on. So this is the kind of rubbish civilization they have shoved on the world. And I don't mind being on YouTube saying this. Okay. So this is one part of one answer, and this answer to the second part of your question. Second question. The first question, see, intervention again is the wrong term. I'll tell you why. We are never outside anything. We are always inside the universe we describe. We are always inside the country we describe. We are always inside the family we describe. We are always inside the individual we talk about, etc. This business of being outside is precise source of alienation in human cognition, which is now wired into us, like Raghava was explaining nicely, because of the vast digital edifice that has been created. But even before that, there was cognitive alienation built into modern systems of thought, because the immediate physical setting has been mattering less and less and less as the Industrial Revolution has advanced. And you think about it, the uprooting of villages, which lunatic will do that before the Industrial Revolution? Except a conqueror, nobody else would do that.
Yeah.
It's only after life elsewhere is possible and there's a remote controlled economy which is battery operated, can you think of these options in the first place, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is, in my understanding, only participation, no intervention. And the question is, where and how do we participate and with whom, right? And those to me are the deepest cultural questions. And they should be framed culturally. And I urge people to think of them culturally and philosophically rather than politically, for reasons which are very obvious. Political modernity is a disaster. It will only breed its dialectical opposite and create wars eventually, ideological wars or actual wars. Okay, you've had a
Yeah.
Cold War in this world for 45 years, which took toll of millions of innocent lives, thanks to this kind of white man's stupidity. Now we need to think very differently, and we need to bring the white man himself out of his binary mindset, right? That which imprisons the modern white imagination is precisely this, that they think in terms of twos, thanks to Rene Descartes, Cartesian
Yeah.
dualism. And the
Yeah.
entire culture has not only dualized, it has fragmented and eventually particulated. I'm going with physics metaphors. And then in the end, what are left? Quarks, or not even that, you know. So nihilism or nihilism, whatever you want to call it, is then the default on which a consumer economy can flourish. Because so long as all values other than greed are banished or called by, some name associated with greed, you know, you convert everything ultimately to greed, and then you sell that. Whether it's love or joy or beauty or romance, you're going to sell all of that on the grounds of greed. So there's a whole metaphysics of greed. You talked about the question of the grammar of greed. This is the metaphysics which is there inside us. And we can learn this through meditation and dhyan and other things. We can learn this, how corrupted we are because of the exposures we have been living through. Now, all of this is basically a way to seduce you away from yourself. And unless we return to ourselves, and return to ourselves not every year, not every month, not every week, not every day, not every hour, but every moment, there's no way out. So instead of intervention, I will say awareness and participation, participatory awareness. And that begins right here at home first. The reason I stay with my parents, for instance, the reason I left my life in the West and came back here and began to live close to them and ultimately moved in back with them. This, where in the Western world would this happen? What culture in this world today still has these values? And here I'm no exception. I'm quite normative by a very large yardstick. You can go to any part of India and you'll find people either moving in with parents or parents moving in with them, rather than just being sent to old people's homes to die in loneliness. They'd rather have grandchildren or their own children, or. And this brings me to your point about restraint and renunciation. It's not about restraint and renunciation, because even in pre modern times in India, very few people went in the direction of renunciation. Most people were worldly, but everybody had respect for restraint and renunciation. Today, nobody seems to understand why somebody would be so stupid. And that's the real crisis. That to me is the real crisis, because who do we respect? We respect Djokovic, Virat Kohli, Naren Bhai, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, people with power, people with muscle, MRF tires. That's what we respect. We're not going to respect Ramana Maharishi or Ramakrishna or Narayana Guru or Basavanna or somebody like that. Why would we? I mean, they are mendicants. Why would you live such psychotic, neurotic lives? That's the modern imagination about the true man of spirit for whom the universe is, his living room. So my point is that the inversion of values which modernity has introduced for 5 centuries by celebrating conquest upon conquest is so severe that nobody I have met can be said to be exempt from it. It goes very deep, which is why I begin my Grammar of Greed book with the idea of conquest, and then I talk about war, then conquest, and then speed, because that is the way modern civilization has quote unquote evolved. I'm using that sarcastically, to this point of precipitate stupidity and denigration of human dignity and dignity of everything alive. So when I say participation, our first order of business is to restore and renew ourselves, not restrain, but renew ourselves as individuals. Once you start doing that, you realize that pathways open up. You already begin to know what you must do with your parents, for instance, or what you must do with your children, or what you must do with your friends. And nobility or charity or whatever it is, it should begin with the home. It may not end with the home, but it should begin there. But the modern world has devalued the home completely. Homes are almost indistinguishable from hotels now. People visit their homes like they visit tourist spots. So you made a zoo animal out of yourself, and you want to look at other animals, other human beings as zoo animals, and yourself you want to be looked at. And that you call culture, and you pour your bile out on page 3. you know so this is the sort of world of bling which are celebrities. Somebody's selling gutka, somebody's selling cigarettes, somebody's selling an automobile, somebody's selling a prime minister. But that's basically what is left of Indian culture in the official sense. But thankfully, it is restricted to that because India is vast and the ocean is so big. There's always going to be other fish which are going to give us hope to create a very different kind of world.
Beautiful. I think we'll wrap up on that note. I feel like we can't top that. Um, I really, really liked the way you framed kind of the answer being spiritual introspection. I feel like of like the solutions to this is neither it doesn't exist on all these hierarchical levels. It's basically a return to what matters in life, what matters in the world around us, what truly matters, and truth, and the real truth, and not the truth that's sold to us. So yes, I think we'll end there. If Raghava, do you have any closing comments?
I think
Go
the
ahead.
Purushartha model and the idea of ashrama, the institution of
Yes,
ashrama, which allows you to go through lives with grace. The idea of tyaga, the idea of seva. These are the metaphysics that Asimji has pointed us to, and that's our inspiration. Thank you so much, Asimji.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Really looking forward to your upcoming books. Also, I think I'd really love your first copy if you could do that for us, and I'm sure it's going to be brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for a really scintillating discussion. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Namaste.